all the steps and all the reports that were generated. And it was interesting how many reports we were able to cease making because we found out that people were making reports that other people didn't actually read. That kind of makes sense. So that may not happen in other companies, but I have seen that in some cases. So asking why do this is a tying into Jeff's comment and Ron's about financial value to your customer. There may be other people in your company that look at it, but is it adding value to your customer is another thing to ask for that. Oh, here's another good one. The actual versus ideal or perfect. So these become very politically charged exercises. You may not think they are, but when you start sitting down in a conference room and writing down what people are actually doing and whether that is really happening versus the idealized, does that kind of make sense? So there are situations where there might be some type of evaluation that takes place, and so that's the idealized case, that there is a check performed, but in reality it's just rubber stamp, moves on. So those are things that are helpful for this. We're trying to remove complexity. So we just want to draw a line for that if possible. We don't want to have any duplication. Draw a mark through that. What control points to check for errors? And going back to this, why do this? If we find out that we have to do it, is there a more effective way or efficient way to do that? So are most of you familiar with flowcharting symbols? I'm just going to draw a couple from a beginner standpoint. Frequently you have some type of connector or start node. Then we use arrows to connect those. Rectangular boxes are typically a process, some type of activity. Another time you might see one that looks like this. This is a document. It's typically a paper type document. Although in today's use of SharePoint, that may actually be some type of form. Another one that's important to have is these decision. Typically on those you have either yes or no is common, although there may be other ones you might see. You may also see something that looks like just a cylinder. That's a storage database. And there's a variety of other ones that you may see from time to time. Any comments about flowcharts from experience or implementation?
I could ask it as a question. What quality tool have we used that a flowchart applies directly to? Not to use the class.
Can I answer?
Okay.
Can you restate the question?
We talked about a quality tool that flowcharts apply directly to. They're kind of the driving, basically, they're the driving tool before you do the next step.
And it wasn't today that we discussed
It wasn't today that we discussed it. I think it was the class, 2 classes ago.
The things you taught us requires
A flowchart.
in order to be successful in using it.
That was like 2 weeks ago.
It was 2 weeks ago. Way back. And so just, now that we're doing flowcharts, we kind of did it before, just tying them back together.
You might need one more hint.
There's some, it's an acronym that we often,
Ah, yes, okay.
When we do FMEAs, each line item in your FMEA is usually correlates, you could map it out to a flowchart that flows through.
and same with control plans. You take your
Yep.
FMEA and convert it directly into a plan for controlling those risks. And without the initial flowchart, you really wouldn't know at what steps
You're going to go through the process.
So the biggest takeaway from this is that these tools are often interrelated.
Yep.
They're a great tool to use to understand your current state. If you go into some place that's conducting business, they're doing the work, but nobody did a good job documenting. You can gather the people who possess the knowledge to sit down and put together a process flow chart.
So, good for training purposes
Yeah.
as well. So a couple things of it, try to keep the complexity of these down so that they're easy to follow, because if you get too many lines going everywhere, they frequently just kind of get ignored. All right. Next one we're going to look at are check sheets. This is the one that has a variety of different names. Sometimes you might see the phrase tally sheet. So these are good tools for organizing your facts, collecting. I'm just going to add the word observation. I make the subtle distinction here because facts sometimes get into, I don't know how to exactly put that, but what I will say is this. If you write what you observe, that your perception is a fair way of placing that observation. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Because when you start saying facts, then you, what you saw can be challenged potentially. So it's a very subtle distinction.
Yeah,
there.
two people watch the same thing and record different facts, right?
Right, and that's why, and the other thing I like about the word observation is it hopefully reinforces the fact that we want you to see that, to be present at the recording of that observation. Does that make sense? So in other words, you can't sit in your office, which has no windows, and make an observation on the floor. Kind of like one supplier wanted to compile some data for me before they sent it to me. I just sent all kinds of warning flags up in my head. I was like, I just want the check sheet. Just give me the raw data. No, I need to compile it before I can send it. And I never understood why that needed to be necessary. So we're going to get data from these check sheets, tally sheets. And in my opinion, this is about the simplest of the tools. I don't know if we should rank them by simplicity, but is there one that's much easier than, so one we have going on down in Sioux Falls, we have rivets that we use to hold our aluminum structure together, and these rivets have been breaking at a higher rate than we would like. So what we've done is broke them into the different failure modes. I'm just going to call them A, B. Failure mode, so we have a check sheet that is out at the workstation that has an illustration of the failure mode. And then what we've done is by shift, actually it's by, we make the large digital billboards. So each one of those assemblies per day, I can't remember if it's almost 10, maybe made through that work center. And then we tabulate how many failures were observed on each of those. Does that kind of make sense? So by display, I have tabulation of that. Any comments about using check sheets or tally sheets?
I think they're critical because you have to verify that your corrective action was effective. How better to do it than to say, these were the number of defects we had before we implemented the change, and this is what we got based on the change. So they're pretty important for a number of reasons.
Yes, Jamie?
These check sheets are very simple, but there needs to be a lot of thought process put into how they're laid out as well, because you can spend a lot of time gathering data and at the end of it, the data won't tell you anything. Going back to your fishbone diagram, if you circled environment was one of the key parts of that, then maybe you want to, if your plant is open to the environment and it's nights are cooler than the days, then that might be something to know shift versus which assembly number it was. Making sure that you look at what your key things were in the fishbone diagram, and making sure that they're present out here. Otherwise, you see a high on number 2 and low on number 4. You don't know when those were built if you're looking at it for shift or for environment.
In our case, that added, we could chase down that, but that is a very good point to emphasize that it may look simple, but in other words, if you lumped all of one day together, very quickly you lose a lot of that resolution that would have been valuable to that. So yes, thank you for emphasizing that. All right, so other types, it's common to break these out into time periods, but you could also break it into any other strata that may make interest to you.
You talk about the importance of auditing this. Once you start collecting this data, and the workers are working and they're collecting data about whoever designed the check sheet, to go back and audit it, that it's being done correctly.
I didn't mention anything about that, but I do appreciate that that is kind of an assumption that it's being collected in a I will piggyback onto that, it's not that someone is manipulating it, but by absence of recording it can skew things just as easily as over-reporting.
A lot of this stuff is left to the interpretation of the worker. And they don't all understand the same thing.
And correct. So one way to do that, if you're stretched for resources, is that don't wait until you've collected 2 months of data to go back and look at it to see if it makes sense. Check it as quickly as you can to the time that it happened, because frequently that interpretation rule will cause, I want to say, anomalies that when you did your fishbone diagram, you're thinking it's this reason, and then all of a sudden this other one's like, why is that one having so many problems?
Well, you've got another tool over there that you've showed in your, where you, let's say your objective is to collect 2 months worth of data. Well, you can, with 1 week's worth of data, you can go find out your upper and lower controls and determine whether or not variation, shift over shift is consistent.
All right, so the other thing I wanted to add with this is that another term of this is just a recording sheet, which is basically what I just had on the board, except it's a little bit, in this case, you can have, for example, if you're having the members of a team, and all right, so their example is meetings on track, yes or no, getting good participation from our team members, we're getting good decisions. And then in this area, each of the 3 people will give a score from 1 to 10 of yes, I agree, or no, I don't. It's a way to get a recording of the meeting progress. Another use of the same type of concept is for check sheets. That's redundant, isn't it? Let's change that word to checklists. So this is frequently, my example for this is like pre-flight checks for aircraft. It's like, did you do it, yes or no? Checking that step that it was achieved. A little bit of a trick question. Can anyone else identify another specialized type of check sheet, tally sheet, etc., and what the name of that is? I know all of you pre-read the chapters before you walk in here.
You bet.
Internal auditing needs element. Yeah, that's right. We used a checklist for our internal audits just recently.
All right, good.
Preventive maintenance schedules, PM schedules.
Right? But what I'm looking for is another, it's not a checklist, but what's another type of tallying that can be done?
You have a chart where you list the same thing.
Something that you guys at Larson might do if you've shipped a few doors in your lifetime. Do you ever track the location of where that scratch is at after it arrives at the department?
Measles chart.
Measles chart, there we go. I knew if I gave enough hints.
You did.
You know, Jerry, when you preface the question with this may be tricky, you're not gonna get a lot of answers.
Well, I tried simple before, and then I got disagreement from Jamie that check sheets are not simple. They need to have some thought put into it. All right, so measles chart is also a locations chart. So sometimes you'll see this crude example. This is a crude vehicle with our wheels on it. And so a measles chart or location chart, I've seen it frequently on material handling issues or shipping issues. If you you just mark on this graphic the location of where those scratches or dents occurred, and then it gives a pictorial representation of where that is happening. And the name measles comes from, it looks like a bunch of dots on your product. Does that make sense? So it's a very powerful tool to communicate the frequency and location of scratches or dents.
And Jerry, another great example that I think people will remember is the World Wars. They have planes, and they came back and they did measles charts, and they quickly saw where the critical areas that could take a plane down were and reinforced the steel there. So when the planes came back all shot up, they measles charted it, and where no bullets existed meant that plane went down and they died. So they focused on reinforcing the planes in those areas.
Where there were no bullets.
Correct, because they didn't make it back, they died. So they identified the weak points of the planes that way.
So they're assuming where the bullets were the strong points, I guess is his
No
point.
bullets. Yes.
Because it didn't take 'em
If you
down?
went down, you got a bullet in a bad spot. So
If I
you-
lived-
If you're lit up with bullets on the tail and you made it back, obviously you're fine.
That's a true story, you guys can Google that, that's where I found that. That's one of the wars.
One of the wars? Did they do that with arrows also, or?
Yes,
There's this one from Chicago, you can probably Google this one too, there's one from Chicago, with people getting shot, they did the same thing.
Makes sense, critical vital areas.
I'm kidding.
That would make sense. Where do you want to put your armor if you can't have armor?
Or maybe just not drive through that part of town. I don't know.
Actually, this is not one for this, but it's an interesting story, for measles charts on actually gunshot wounds. If you look at where people will shoot, if you're a police officer, why body armor is so effective? Body armor covers about 50% of your body, but it'll block about 90 to 95% of bullets. If you did a measles chart on where people shoot, it's always at your center.
Center mass, they taught us in the Army.
That's right, so when any of you are in your Hunger Games, you'll know where to protect yourself. All right, so let's go ahead and cover a few more, and then we'll take our mid-class break. Next one is histograms. The key thing with a histogram is that we're trying to do a frequency chart. And so you frequently see these bar charts, and these very thin lines are my quick way of showing a bar chart. So this is, and these these are ideally evenly spaced units here. It's the number of occurrences, so this one would have 4, 5, 3, and 2. And for that bucket, if you will, or range, there were 4 items or observations in that range. What's interesting with histograms, the author recommends 50 to 100 data points to get a good histogram. I've used them frequently for less than that. Does anyone else have any strong feelings on the number in a histogram?
Just that Minitab won't allow you to use less than 30. That seems to be the rule even I've always used.
Do you know why Minitab likes 30? Or
Statistical significance.
I was going to say degrees of confidence or statistical significance, that's right.
I myself have created my own histograms for less than that, but I use it more from a quick representation. But it's important to recognize that if it's helpful to know how many observations went into the construction of that histogram. Does that make sense? So personally for myself, I would feel comfortable using definitely less than 50, but it would be good practice or politeness to tell other people that are reading that chart how many data points went into that. All right, so the idea of a histogram is that it helps us look at the, you remember these terms, the spread and, which would be spread about the central tendency or spread about the mean. So by this graphic, if this were 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 in units of measure of length, we could say that our central tendency is in the 0.2 units. And we can see that the range of observations would be from 0.1 to 0.4. Does that make sense? So by just a graphical representation, we can see that very quickly. Other things that we're interested about this spread is that it can help us identify special causes. And this is where the 50 to 500 or more really play in, help us out, is that if you have down by 30 or 10 or very small sample size, it's possible to get what will look like outliers when they're really not, because the chart just hasn't really filled in itself, if that makes sense. But if you get into these higher quantities that go into that, you will start to see, trying to decide if I'll redraw this. We will. All right, so if you see bar chart like that, that would tell you that, or I would look at that and say, oh, it seems reasonable. It's a normal distributed process. But then if you see something like that, and then you see another set of, another hump, if you will, or a bimodal distribution, I start getting curious that there's two different populations that are feeding that, that collection. So it's a bimodal. Other situations you might see is if the tails don't tail off. That would be a hint that something's kind of going on.
Maybe some sorting.
Sorting, yes. Here's another example that you might see. So if this is the distribution you'd see at your facility, and then your specifications happen to be like right here, that kind of makes sense. What is going on there is that we've taken our normal curve, and then we've chopped off all of this and thrown that away, and we've tried to capture that. But usually what happens is you're actually going to get, you might have some weird shapes like that, meaning that there's some escapes that are coming out. Other things that are interesting related to that is, this doesn't mean you're getting taken advantage of, but maybe it is, that if you have some wide specifications, but if your distribution you observe looks like that, and in your specifications are these squiggle lines, what do you think happened here?
Gave up too quick.
Nope, the one I'm
Two lines assembled,
Yep.
or two lines doing the same thing.
attempting to show here is that your supplier may be taking all the good stuff and giving that to somebody else, and they're chopping the heart out of that distribution and giving you the trash, so to speak. And now that,
Might have to pay them to put some extra yummy on it.
now, that may not necessarily be bad, what has been done here, because your tolerances are still acceptable, but there's a lot of subtle things you can pick up if you have the time to audit your incoming product.
So
This
what
is-
would you do if you had something like that?
Well, the first thing is I would almost smile, just because I'd be impressed that they intentionally did something like this. Because that tells me that these are clever people I'm working with.
So you gotta do something, right? In your data collection and your thinking and in your work, if you see something like that, you can't accept it. You gotta ask more questions, right? You gotta-
I would probably accept it, but I would ask questions.
I can think of an example that I think is probably kind of common in the industry, and that's for active chips, like speed. I know they sort some chips for speed, like this is your target speed, and they'll have the A grade, the B grade, the C grade parts, and they sort, all right, this was the processor that operated at the nominal, these were on the faster ends, the slower ends, and so the ones that fall in, you'd end up with those bins of what falls into that tolerance. So you'd have exactly this.
And there are companies
Depending on
out there
what
that
you order.
push the upper threshold of any device, like hard drives or
Yep,
memory.
and so you have to
device.
buy that specific one, and it would result in this.
Yep.
Never seen the data to show it, but it would make sense.
And also at Panduit, Cat 5 and Cat 6, if Cat 6 underperformed, it became Cat 5. So you might see it all ending up at the top of the spec, but it's just as good, it meets all the requirements.
But Ron points out, I think it would be important to understand, why did we get this? And it's a little disturbing that we're getting this and we didn't know that we're getting it. But that's all part of that cat and mouse game that takes place. Jamie?
Another conversation or a way to bring that up to the supplier is that if that data's gone and if it's truly that diverse, that your CPK data will not be consistent either. If you have that much on either end, you're gonna have a pretty wide range.
And it's not normally distributed. so-
And so it's gonna fail a couple of things there. It might throw up a red flag depending on what your process or what your expectation is.
In my mind, what a mischievous supplier would do would be give me the heart to set my CP values. I say, first article accepted, then all of a sudden this starts happening. I mean, if they're actually being cantankerous with you.
Right.
But
As
maybe I shouldn't let all my
auditors-
secrets
as
out.
auditors, we'll learn that we're supposed to assume everyone is doing their best and positive and honest. And only 4% of people wake up every day to sabotage. Most people try to do a good, honest thing.
Well, but this is not necessarily dishonest, is it, or is it?
It's not, and it happens in the industry. If you have a spec, they list the upper and lower thresholds of their spec.
But the biggest thing I want this side of the room to recognize is you better be aware that this is going on, and if you don't understand that, that's shame on you, the consumer of that, because you're not able to detect that or audit it, just to check on that. So that's one reason I ask my suppliers for evidence of your process measurements at their factory. Because some of them aren't even making those measurements, so in that case, that would be more of inattention to that. But if I saw this from Jeff's, then I would know what.
Selling it to the aerospace industry and looking at what was left, right?
All right, so histograms are a powerful tool to communicate spread about the mean and central tendency, and I think they're almost more valuable than showing X bar and the standard deviation. Does that make sense? So I've had great success at multiple places I've worked at where I show the histogram and then I show the specification limits as we have them on our drawings. And most people kind of go, oh, especially when the specification limits are here and here. So this is what we want, and here's what's actually happening. So you don't have to have a lot of statistics background to know that that's just not ideal. All right, so next question I'm going to ask is, for you guys at Onyx, do you create your own histograms by hand, or do you let your software generate them?
Software.
All right, software. Do we have anybody that needs enough to do that they create the histograms by hand?
When you say by hand, what do you mean by hand? You mean writing, or you get Excel, create a histogram?
That you're going to use the rule of thumb of approximate the square root of the number of observations.
Ryan might do that, but in general, no.
And now they,
That's right.
I mean, there's a difference between doing it for novelty as opposed to, I gotta get this done by 9 o'clock tonight before I go home. So, what I will say is that in your book, I'm not gonna ask you, but recognize that when you create a histogram, that changing the cell, and what we mean by cell is how wide this region is to put it in that frequency. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So it's positive that most people create them with software, but recognize, once again, this is this mischievous side of me coming out, you can change the buckets, if you will, to change the shape of your histogram. Now that was a bigger problem back in the day when people, maybe I'm showing my age here, created these by hand so you could change how wide this is in order to change the shape of what you're, maybe Brian's never seen that before.
it makes sense, like, for example, the bottom one, if yours were wide enough, if your band, say you split that into 3 bands, that could look totally normal. The 2
Yes.
side ones would show on the side, the 2 center ones would show in the center, and then the other ones would show on the top. 1, 2, 3, you totally look like you had a normal, all good product, because your bins were 2 wide.
So the reason I'm mentioning that, have anyone used Excel to generate a histogram? You can actually write your own bins in there. So there's no rule that says your bins have to be equal distance. So just be aware of that. I won't go. Does anyone want to see how to do a histogram in Excel, or? I didn't get a lot of enthusiasm for that. So we'll move on to our next one. Actually, this is a continuation on the histogram. So these are off of page 15. When you see a histogram, that you're going to have a normally shaped, like the classic bell curve, and typically they're symmetrical about that central point bell shape curve. The other thing I wanted to mention is that one standard deviation is about 68%. But if you get up to 3 standard deviations, that's 99.73. All right, I think let's take at 6:45 by this clock we'll reconvene